think obviously we've got two simultaneous shows happening at the moment. We've got the UFC 291 card happening, and obviously you've got Terrence Crawford versus ERROL Spence happening on the same day. Now, I think both of these fights, obviously both the UFC 291 and the Crawford vs Spence, shows the difference between boxing and MMA. If you look at UFC 291, the card is absolutely stacked. Like literally from the bottom to the top, there's great fights after great fights after great fights. You've got obviously the top of the card, which is the BMF fight between Justin Gaethje versus Dustin Poirier. Then below that you've got Blachowicz versus Alex Pereira. Then below that you've got it was supposed to be Stephen Thompson versus Michel Pereira. Then below that you've got I believe you got the fight between Tony Ferguson versus Bobby Green. And below that you got Kevin Holland fighting as well, right? So you've literally got, the card is absolutely stacked from the bottom to the top. Even the prelims have got decent fights on it. Well, if you look at Crawford versus Spence, there are decent fights here and there, but they're not good enough fights to be standalone headline events. The UFC 291, each fight on that card, like at the top end of the card, the televised card, could be a standalone event in its own right. They could literally have UFC 292 for Blachowicz versus Pereira. And for several fights under that card, Michel Pereira versus Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, that could be its headline, its own event. The same way that when Kevin Holland fought Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, that happened. But like, let's be real, with Crawford vs Spence, the undercard, the rest of the card, literally the rest of the card, apart from that one fight, Crawford versus Spence, the rest of the fight card is not stacked. Now the reason why this happens is because when you're negotiating for a super fight on the magnitude of Crawford versus Spence, both fighters want a lot of money, and fair enough, they deserve it, right? Okay, but the point is, if both fighters are getting paid such astronomical purses, I think both Crawford and Spence are both getting 10 million a piece for this fight, at least 10 million, and that's before pay-per-view. So with pay-per-view buys, it could potentially go up to 20 million, 30 million. So both of them are making a lot of money for this fight. Now, when you're paying two fighters that much money, right? What happens is the rest of the card is going to be lacking, because let's be real, the promoters of the show need to make a substantial profit from the show. So what they do is the rest of the card is not going to have the best fighters on it, because they know if they stack the rest of the card up with good fighters, then their profit margins are going to be thin, because they're going to have to pay these good fighters a substantial amount of money. Well, if you look at the UFC model, right, the UFC model, let's just call it how it is. I mean, the fighters are to some extent underpaid, but the fact that the fighters are underpaid, they can afford to actually pay them, put several good fighters on the card, because their fighters are underpaid. Because their fighters are underpaid, they can afford to do that. They could put like 5-6 great fighters on the card. And the ironic thing is, back in the day, when you look at Don King cards, and don't get it twisted, Don King is not a good person, but let's give credit where it's due. Back in the day, he used to stack the cards up, just the way the UFC is doing right now. Don King used to stack the cards up. Now, the reason why he was able to do that was a similar reason to Dana White. He literally used to underpay his fighters. So when a lot of fighters are getting underpaid, they're getting paid less money, they can literally put on several good fighters on a card. But with boxing, because of its integrity to some extent, because obviously the sport has changed, promoters can't afford to underpay their fighters the way they can in the UFC, and back in the day with Don King when he used to put on his cards. So I just think it's an interesting analogy. I think it analogizes both sports this weekend. You got UFC 291, which is absolutely stacked from top to bottom with great fights, and then you got the boxing fight, which everyone was waiting for, Crawford versus Spence. But if you look at the actual card is not stacked one bit. So yeah, I just think it's an interesting analogy. It shows like the difference between both sports, like the way the management of both sports is done. Literally, one card is absolutely stacked, while another card is absolutely bare, apart from the main event. Obviously, I'm a massive boxing fan. I'm a massive MMA fan. So this is like this weekend is almost a dream for me. So I'm just glad that it's finally happened, and I think this potentially could be one of the most best fight weekends in the past decade. I think maybe to be fair, we've had great fight weekends in the past. I remember when Canelo fought Kovalev, and on that same weekend we had Nate Diaz versus Masvidal for the ironically the BMF belt, which is what's being fought for this today. So yeah, I feel like the BMF belt brings a lot of good karma in terms of fight cards. I don't know what it is, but it brings a lot of good karma. So that's just my opinion. Tell me your opinion. Do you think what I'm saying is true, or do you think what I'm saying is ridiculous? It's not true. I would love to hear what you lot want to say about that. But yeah, tell me what you think below, and we can get something going. We can have a lot going on in terms of what's actually happening. So we can have a discussion about what's going on in the sport. So just tell me what you think, and like and subscribe to the channel, because I've got a lot more content coming your way. Peace.